Good afternoon, everybody. I'm looking forward to this because this is an amazing panel, and I think about China. Chinese companies have been in the news a lot, thanks to it being a presidential election year, and the media has brought up a lot of issues concerning Chinese companies and investment in the United States. So very, very topical. We're going to talk for a little while, but I do encourage you, if you've got a question, raise your hand. Let's bring it into the discussion, even if it's not the end of the discussion, because I think that's an important part of it. Hopefully you've read everyone's bios, because it really is an esteemed panel. But I want to just kick things off with asking each of the members of our panel to take a couple of minutes to kind of introduce themselves in the context of what they're doing and working on right now as related to this panel. So let's start with Selig.
Carol, thank you. I'm with Foley & Lardner, and my practice really extends to both working with U.S. companies investing in China, working right now on a large infrastructure project, an agri company as well, pharmaceutical collaboration agreements, as well as FDI into the United States itself. And I think this morning's panel dealt largely with the M&A environment in China, and I think much of our focus today will be on the environment here. And my work has really been at all levels of the food chain. So, for example, there was a reference made earlier today to the EB-5 program, and that's an ability for middle class, if you will, investors from China, for example, if they invest $500,000 or $1 million to really get a visa, which will allow their families to take advantage of living here and, of course, the education infrastructure here in the United States itself. And then, of course, it's also working with privately held companies, and their challenges of coming into the U.S. market are very different than that of larger companies. And then, of course, you have the larger companies that are coming in, which, because of the nature of their acquisitions, the size, perhaps the sensitivity of some of the industries that they're involved in, present CFIUS and other political sensitive issues as well. So hopefully in the course of the discussion today, we'll touch on each of those particular segments themselves.
Wang Wei.
Hi. Hi, Carol.
And known as really the father of M&A in China.
Yeah, well...
or so I've been told.
Well, thank you. Actually, just here. I had a firm. It's called China M&A Group, which we set it up about 17 years ago. Probably one of the pioneers in China. And all those years we are focus on merger acquisitions, mostly, I would say first about 10 years, focus on local. Try to privatize SOEs, those government-owned enterprises, and also try to integrating private sectors grew up. And then recent 5-6 years, we get a lot of pressures going abroad to buy, representing China come to buy Europe, Japan, Korea, Latin Americans, of course, United States. So this is what we do right now. We had a small fund, and even we had a small M&A exchange. So we do trading, and so this is the business part. And also I representing China M&A associations, which has been set up 10 years ago as a grassroots, button-up, non-governmental association, and has been over 500 institution members, spread out, not only in China, and also in Europe, Japan, and United States. So hopefully, China M&A markets be part of the global market, and we have a lot of things to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Wang Ying.
Very impressive thing to hear.
Thank you. I've worked at it.
My name is Ying Wan, and I'm with Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, New York branch. And I begin my introduction with an official disclaimer. What I'm saying here is just my personal opinion, doesn't necessarily representing the institution. And I appreciate this opportunity here to share some of my observations for for the bank's adventures here, we are mainly doing commercial lending in the United States market. But because we are kind of one of the biggest international financial institutions in the world, therefore, all the transactions we are involved in the meantime would be multi-million dollars. But on the other hand, one way or another, either from the borrower side or from the transaction side, would involve some international elements behind it, which bring up very interesting elements towards the deal structure, towards the negotiation, also towards different parties' expectations while you're doing business with an international environment. So I think this is a great forum for me to share some of my personal perspective with everybody here, and also I think this could be a good opportunity to promote future business opportunities, and as well as to smoothing the transaction structure with the business booming time in the long run.
Great. We want to talk about those opportunities in a moment. Ewan, just take a moment.
Thanks, Carol. My name's Ewan Relly. I'm from BDA, Business Development Asia. I'd love to say thanks to Carol and also to Roger and David and George for putting on a great conference. Jamie Dimon got into trouble about, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago or 18 months ago by describing himself as doing God's work. Well, I think I'm going to make the same claim today, that we at BDA and all of us on this panel are doing God's work, because the U.S. today is suffering from constraints in capital, from soft real estate markets, and from lingering unemployment. And what the U.S. needs is investment into this country today. And the single best source of investment into the U.S. today should be Chinese capital. There are lots of Chinese companies here today who want to invest in the West, and it's about time we started welcoming those companies, not discouraging them. And Carol, you have a very important role at Bloomberg to dispel this nonsensical behavior by both political parties at the moment. China is not, to some extent, China is a competitor, but principally China's job is to be, China's role in the future of the world will be as a partner of the U.S., not a competitor. So I'm thrilled to be here to try and help.
That's a great point. We do often talk on Bloomberg that China and the U.S. should not be foes. They really need one another, and I think this is something we certainly can explore. Lawrence, just take a moment, just quickly.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kara. And I'm the chairman of China Entrepreneur Forum, which is the leading business leader association in China. And my job is to promote the cooperation between China business leader and the U.S. business leader. And I came to the United States 5 years ago and 3 years ago, and I formed the platform called China-U.S. Business Leader Roundtable. And we host this roundtable once a year in New York Stock Exchange to exchange ideas and talk about the challenge we face. And this is one of my job now. And my another job is to do the cross-border investment. My company is called Civco International Group. I'm the founder and the chairman, and we're doing the cross-border M&A and also investment. My client, I have clients in the United States and also have more clients in China, and now I'm doing those kind of business and hopefully work with everyone.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to throw out some quick numbers here, certainly playing off of what Ewan said. China's on track, apparently, to invest about $8 billion in the U.S. this year. Energy projects, aviation projects. You have the $2.6 billion deal to buy the AMC theater chain. By 2020, accumulated Chinese investment could reach as high as $200 billion. Employment of 400,000 Americans, and this is according to the folks over at the Rhodium Group. So let's set the stage, because you brought up the idea of U.S. needs the investment from China. They need that impact. It will create jobs and so on and so forth. How would you, Ewan, describe the investment environment of Chinese companies? I mean, how eager are they and ready and willing to invest in the United States?
There's a gentleman in the room today called Duke Chen, and he comes from King D, which is one of the best-known software companies in China. I asked Mr. Chen what percentage of his revenues are international today. He says 10%. And that's just an example of a fantastic leading Chinese company working with many multinational customers in China, helping provide enterprise software for Bank of America and others, but hardly has any business outside China today. So I think that's just one example of a company I know well by reputation. I've never met before, but there are thousands of companies like that. The trouble is, it's a big step to come to the U.S., and I think it is a frightening and difficult place to invest at the moment because as a country, we're not welcoming Chinese investment nearly enough.
I mean, just to continue on that theme a bit, China's percentage of FDI globally is only, I believe, 2.6%, and so there's huge room to grow in that respect. One of the commentators mentioned today, and it's fascinating, I think 2 years ago, the wage differential between Mexico and China was 200%. Today it is flat. So as China is moving up the value chain, being able to come to the United States as a market for its goods and services to expand, but also to acquire technology and to take advantage of the infrastructure, the knowledge, the expertise that America offers, is an extraordinary opportunity for both countries and companies within it. Kuwait Technologies, who's been in the news a lot, why were they coming to the United States? Because as the second largest telecom manufacturer after Ericsson in the world, they needed to expand their markets. So clearly, as Chinese companies adapt best practices and view themselves more as global citizens, we'll be seeing more and more of that. And just one other data point that Roderick Cohen from Sullivan Cromwell mentioned yesterday. It may not be well known to us, but for example, Chinese banks that are present here in the United States, Ying's Bank, ICBC, and others, during the Lehman crisis, provided an extraordinary level of liquidity to the U.S. markets, and it is something that within informed circles is something that we obviously in the United States are hugely grateful for having done so. So I think looking at China as a partner, and I think what we're finding also is Chinese companies are not here for the short haul. They're here to invest. They're here to employ Americans. They're here to expand their R&D. They're here to learn. Yes, they're here also to export technology so they can apply the AMC acquisition that you mentioned for over $2 billion. Why did the Wanda Group do that? One, it becomes the largest theater chain in the world.
Right.
But to be able to learn the systems and the processes, how you can expand within such a huge consumer market in China was, I think, one of the very reasons that acquisition was strategic for it.
Wang, I'd love for you to weigh in
Yeah.
because there are so many challenges, and it is a presidential election year, and you have various candidates making various statements, but it feeds an anti-Chinese and China sentiment in this country and makes people nervous.
Well, the first thing you have to know that China has been developing 30 years toward the market economy. And the driving force is not central planning, it's market oriented. The privatization, the middle class that grew up, the China market has been part of global market. So the China become globalized. It's not if China entrepreneurs like not. They had to do that. They had to upgrading their brand, upgrading their networking, upgrading their market. Mm-hmm. So if they had to go somewhere because they are not small case.
No different from a very American company, Coca-Cola, which is now an incredibly global company.
Yeah, so they have grown up. So if you not go to the United States, you go to Europe, mm-hmm. Japan, Africa. So this just happened 30 years ago, just like Japanese. So this is something we pretty understanding. There is strong resentment at this moment. Not today. I mean, in the past 10 years, there's always strong resentment about so-called communist and central planning economy, a market-led economy. But the thing has changed so much. You have to understand China has fundamentally changed. The globalization, the privatization had changed China to be part of globalization. So in that case, you had to give the time and help China to be more transparent, better corporate governance, and better financed, and in the more market way. So that is not just confrontation, it's a help each other.
How do we clear up, though, the concerns about the involvement of the Chinese government, also going through a transition this year? Lawrence, let me ask you, because that's, I think, part of the concerns. How much involvement is the Chinese government in various Chinese companies who may be looking to make investments in the United States?
Yes, and China is a country, and the government play a very important role in the economy. And there are many state-owned company or SOE. So for those companies, definitely they need to run their business according to the international regulation. And I think the government will give them some help, definitely. But I think mostly the government encourage Chinese company to go global. Right now, I know, and many the private company, even though they're domestic company, they still get help from the government. This is for sure. Yeah.
Please.
I think there's no question right now that China's become, a significant participant in the global economy. And my question really relates, you see this investing by China around the world right now. And most people believe that the technology flow particularly has been a one-way flow with China. And my question is, with the Chinese companies now investing around the world, what's the probability of them actually bringing that technology back to China, given the lack of intellectual property protection and the lack of patent protections? Will they actually, bring this technology back to China? And I'm really referring to these mid-micro-cap companies, not the large SOEs and privately well-connected companies.
I think clearly the concerns of the U.S. business community is intellectual property protection, it's market access, it's investment conditions. So those are really the concerns of U.S. companies. If Chinese companies buy U.S. companies or control interests in them, then I think they will protect their intellectual property. One of the things we discussed yesterday is how U.S. companies position themselves for acquisitions by Chinese companies or to have Chinese companies participate, for example, in an auction process. And one of the examples is Hawker Beechcraft, which is in bankruptcy, one of the four leading corporate jet manufacturers in the world. And they cleverly, a year ago, began to separate the military applications because the Hawker part of the business also manufactures aircraft which is retrofitted for military applications, and in fact it has agreements with 40 different countries supplying small jets. So they began the process of taking that intellectual property, putting it in separate subsidiaries, leaving the commercial in others, so that now as they are in bankruptcy and as they're in the auction environment, they are able, they believe, to satisfy CFIUS concerns and also deal with these issues that might be sensitive. So I think one of the takeaways for all of us is that as one is involved on the sales side and wishes to have Chinese participants in the market, thinking about how to isolate sensitive areas is an important consideration. Why, for example, this corporate jet market? Because as part of the 12th five-year plan, the ceiling of 13,000 feet and lower is being opened to private jets. 70,000 new pilots are to be trained in China between now and 2020. And when Perella Weinberg did its first cut of potential bidders for Hawker Beechcraft, 12 of the 15 companies identified were Chinese. To Ewan's point, if one is precluding China as an active participant in one's M&A process here in the United States, you are leaving, on the table or off the table an entity that could really contribute to value, particularly if the company is oriented towards consumer growth, because there is no larger consumer growth market in the world than China. And indeed, the government policy is encouraging consumption as their exports are flat, and they're looking to vitalize their economy and to continue to build a robust middle class.
Ying, ICBC has had some success in doing some deals.
Yes, we have been successful even though we are a new player in this market. But I think from some observations, I feel the bankers tend to be really sophisticated from an international level, and they position themselves as one of the international players, as other counterparties, sophisticated counterparties, as those big European banks or United States banks. And in the meantime, therefore, the deal we are involved in, on the one hand, the selection of the transaction would be very strategic. We would be very conservative on that approach. Therefore, we would look at the potential sponsor borrowers' cash flow potentials. And the deal we are actually making definitely is going to make sense in many ways instead of just speculate the money. That's one important part. On the other hand, we would evaluate sponsors, the potential buyers and the sellers' relationship, potentially kind of historically connection would give us insurance or assurance that kind of evaluates the credit profile in a industry slogan point of view. Then, on the other hand, even though the deal would be international, have some foreign elements involved, but at the end of the day, from the foreign borrower's point of view, if they choose to get funding in the United States, then they have understanding where they hire their financial advisor would advising them, they have to observe different market terms and conditions. So if the funding happens in the United States, then they are going to observing the customary market lending terms and conditions here, definitely, and governed by U.S. law, of course. Then we follow that rule strictly, so we're advising our counterparty about this understanding. If you want to get the funding here, then we'll observe the rule played in the United States. On the other hand, then our international network playing, for example, then we would have a better understanding if that company is international and if their operation mainly focused in China, then we'll have a team to understand their business, to do the due diligence to understand the business is really profitable. This kind of synergy offer us to do the deals as other international banks do, or having some advantage some other banks do not, because our profile tends to be really conservative. For example, even though we observe market terms here, but generally speaking, from the leveraged buyout market, general deals happen according to the survey of the Barclays Bank usually happen around, the leverage ratio would around 40 or 50 around, but the deal we would consider would be much lesser than that. That's just one example of the leverage ratio. On the other hand, as for the covenants, we might require higher, more strict covenants on this. But in the meantime, we would observe some of the market practice here because currently, even though the merger and acquisition market is kind of sluggish, but the borrower trying to push the envelope, so the terms is kind of more borrower-friendly, then we'll observe that. But we probably would require more cash flow control, the covenant. We would require the borrower respect more strict covenants, including control the capital expenditure, and ask them to pledge all the shares, but in the meantime control their cash flow to make sure the cash flow first to pay off the loan, right?
Kind of nice to have.
So, right. So it's a kind of a interesting combination between the conservative as well as observing the market locally. And I think this kind of international network position us in a very advantage situation to make us position us to dealing with both with big players have the China elements or just some big international firms we could be dealing with.
I mean, we talked about some of the challenges, but I mean, deals are getting done.
Yes.
Talk to me about what you're seeing. Actually, let me bring you in a little bit, because I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of your clients, the Chinese clients.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are deals getting done. It's a drop in the ocean at the moment, and I notice, for example, the first Chinese investors in North America, as in the rest of the world, have mostly been energy companies. Again, been generally more welcomed in Canada than in the US, certainly more welcomed in South America than in the US. We're seeing our firm BDA has been engaged by a bunch of Chinese companies recently. We're seeing a lot of interest in industrial investment. But I noticed, for example, that 23 transactions have been signed in the last 12 months of Chinese industrial companies investing in Germany, and there hasn't been nearly as much of that in the US yet. Some examples, there's a fantastic auto parts company called Wangshan, which has a very good US presence and has made probably half a dozen acquisitions here already. We see Hong Kong companies like Li and Feng, quite aggressive. I know it's not a mainland company, but it's certainly a Chinese company. And we're starting to see Lenovo and others try to expand in the US. But we have worked at BDA with both ZTE and Huawei. Well, there was a prominent article in the press this morning where, again, a cross-party panel of the US Senate has declared them to be improperly influenced by Chinese government and has encouraged US entities of all types not to work with either ZTE or Huawei. It's absolutely
What
nuts.
are they missing? Because you know that there's tremendous momentum over this story since 60 Minutes did it this past weekend. And we've all been on it and trying to understand it and the implications.
I think in some ways, there may be at times legitimate issues that are posed. For example, before this current episode, Australia had banned them from bidding on certain telecom. And Gary Locke, when he was then Secretary of Commerce, to the CEO of Sprint, had advised them not to bring them in as part of their consortium for a large network deal as well. I think there are issues of national security, the ability to disrupt or monitor communications, and we have to be sensitive to that. I think it's issues of transparency, and I think Wang, you had mentioned that as well. Chinese or other companies doing business in the United States are going to have to become more transparent in terms of who are their actual owners,
right?
And have independent and qualified members of boards of directors that can really serve in that capacity as well. But I think to some extent we have to be concerned that some of these issues, is it only paranoia on the Beltway, or are there other issues that really we know that we need to grapple with from the standpoint of national security as well?
I think there's a lot of voters in the US who haven't got jobs today, and it's easy to pick someone. If you're going to pick someone to blame for the fact that employment's been sluggish in the US, it's easy to say, well, it's Chinese underpaid workers who have taken our jobs. Maybe there's an element of truth in that. Clearly a lot of manufacturing's moved offshore, but nobody in their right mind thinks that basic manufacturing should automatically come back to the US. The US has to be more flexible and more dynamic, and there has to be flexibility on both sides. Of course, there are valid national security concerns about the telecom industry. You wouldn't want to give a foreign nation, any foreign nation, necessarily control of the national security apparatus. But a bunch of the stuff that Huawei and ZTE makes are basic telecom components. We shouldn't preclude them from doing normal, conventional business in this country.
Yep.
But commensurately, Chinese companies let's be realistic. Chinese companies face a PR battle, and they're going to need to invest carefully in PR. They're going to need to lobby effectively. Just in the look, part of this is a commercial battle, right? If you're a U.S. company and you want to defend your patch, you'll use whatever you can to scare people about Chinese competition. Commensurately, Chinese companies have to learn how to play the game the U.S. way, and it's gradually happening.
Wait, your association, I'm just curious, in terms of figuring out this issue.
It is. You have to understand China in the last 30 years is central planning economy, socialist economy. So any entrepreneur want to grow up successfully had to go very hard way. They had to zigzag. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they had to cover up. So that's why there's a lot of Chinese company is very in the green area. None is not so much transparent like the United States. This is a historical stage. So right now, we go into global economy. We had to change, had to upgrade, had to get better corporate governance, but it needs some time. And also, the Chinese entrepreneur had to compromise, not only with global economy, also had to compromise with present China control. Mm. So this is something you had to tolerant for a while, and then China entrepreneurs had to learn from the global resentment about their non-transparency. That's a chance they had to change themselves to become more accepted by global standard. So right. That's association try to work. We had to help China company better understanding global standard, and also tell global society, they are just grow up. There's a learning curve. So you have to tolerate with that.
It's a process.
Yes.
Lawrence, yeah, please.
Yeah, and in China, and you can see that there are many listed companies. Those companies listed in the Shenzhen Stock Exchange and the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and also United States here in the MISE. If you saw this, if you take a look at those companies, I think transparency is not a problem. So their disclosure, their annual report and season report, and people every day trade their stock. Everybody can tell the story about those companies. So I think related with this company, the transparency is not a problem. The problem is that for some of the companies, they're not a listed company, so it's hard to get the information. Like this country. They still have some private company. They never want to go to the stock market. So I think there's when you see China, if they are listed company, I think the transparency already be as same as the American company.
If the government not transparent, in that society, if you're transparent, that's suicide.
Ying, you're laughing.
That is China. So you had to go through that period.
There's a history as the market economy came to China.
Right.
Obviously, China's still learning how to play international accounting standards.
But but are other investors, whether it's the U.S. or other countries, right to be a little cautious because you don't know until that transparency is there? Should they not be a little nervous?
It's natural that the U.S. should be cautious, but it would be suicidal for the U.S. to reject all Chinese investment.
But why you still borrow a lot of money is China still not transparent?
Right.
When you borrow money, you don't mention about transparent, right? You just borrow money.
There is that.
There's such a contrast. We have the harsh campaign rhetoric at the presidential level, but every governor in the United States is off to China or receiving delegations.
As a delegation.
That's, Rick Snyder just came back, governor of Michigan, 10 days there. The city of Toledo, 30 years in depression, active effort to bring in Chinese businesses, to establish biotech, pharma, to engage in real estate redevelopment. So at the local level, I think people get it. They understand the synergies that can be created.
Yeah.
And I think it's the need to kind of dampen down the rhetoric and really, engage in a responsible dialogue at all levels.
Listen, I've been doing this going to age myself for 2 decades, and I can remember starting out, and companies were talking about China, and they were concerned about politicians alienating China because of the potential. We have a few minutes left, and I would love to see if anybody has a question. We could go on for a long time because it's a great topic. Does anybody have a question? Let's wrap it up a little bit with, do you have a question? Again? You've missed your quota. It's filled. Go ahead.
Drew, get up here.
Interesting one. We see this mass exodus of funds out of China, investing in many things. I had an interview at The Economist. They asked me, why is China buying like Silicon Valley? But also at the same time, you have in Europe right now some of the governments, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, are turning somewhat more socialist. So you also are starting to see this exodus of funds from Europe. Do you see this as a trend in any way to the United States around the world, the benefit to us? I mean, how do you see this? You see, funds coming from everywhere.
I don't know.
Go ahead.
Feel free.
Well, I think, it's just like I mentioned first, China, the whole economy is booming. Comparatively, in the next 5-10 years, it still grow up. And not just like just grow up, it's to the market-oriented direction. So in that way, China economy had to be integrated with global economy, and just like go through the 30 years ago, like Japan, they had to they go to stage to invest globally. So there's no way to stop that trend. So to go, invest in the United States, Europe, Latin America, Africa, just go that way. For I can understand. We are dealing not with those only with Chinese sovereign funds, with these private sectors. They're old people. There's a lot of investors there, just like a mushroom. It's small, unnotified. They just go everywhere. 500 million, 50 million. There is a couple of incentives. To the private sectors, the number one incentive is safety. They don't not necessarily making money. I invest in the United States. That means we are globalized. We protect it. From whom? Safety. Number one. Number two, we are not just like a new money showing around, show my power. We want investment to get a global momentum, to keep growth. We know the China market is limited. Isolated market, no matter how large the economy, isolated economy is no way to grow up. So they want to get connected. And government encourages them. So there is a lot of things. I was pretty optimistic in next 5 years or 10 years it go that way.
Just two things I wanted to add. Number one, there's a bunch of Chinese private equity firms who are increasingly looking at direct investment in the U.S. It's a huge surprise to me. But last time I was in China, a bunch of funds said, sure, we'd look at investments in the U.S., domestic Chinese private equity funds. Second thing is the cultural links between China and the U.S. are huge. Lots of successful Chinese businessmen and women like to send their kids to school in the U.S., and actually it's almost a problem for China. There is a brain drain. A lot of talented young Chinese people still want to come and live in the U.S. So the bonds are very tight between the two countries. And I think this political chaos will pass sooner or later.
We do need to wrap up. Let me ask you, though, in, 3 years from now, would we have the same discussion or would we see a lot of progress, in your view? Just very quickly. We'll go down. Lawrence.
In 3 years? I think there
5 years?
3 or 5 years, there will be more Chinese company in the United States. I think, according to my experience, 5 years ago, every season, I have one friend come to see me. 4 years ago, every month, one friend come to see me. 3 years ago, every week, one friend come to see me.
It's telling.
This year, every week, I have 3 group friend come from China. I don't have time to take care of them. That's a reality. How do you think about the 3 years? So.
Great. Ewan.
I hope Lawrence is right, because I set up a company 16 years ago to work on cross-border Asian M&A, and I'm just about eking out a decent living today. If Lawrence is right, I might be quite a successful businessman myself one day.
We'll hope for you.
Yeah, I'm very positive about the progress with the current expansion and ambition of the Chinese company indicated. So therefore, we tend to see more deal flow and more complicated or high-profile cases happen in the next few years.
Which would be significant, high-profile.
In another way, 10 years ago, very few people think about today. There's over 300 companies listed in China. China company listed in the United States.
Right.
10 years ago, we never thought about this thing. Next 5 years is a long run for China. We think we are not talking about China investing in the United States. We talk about global firm. It's no China, American, we all together.
Selig.
I think in the last 7 years, a lot of progress has been made in terms of constructive dialogue between China and the United States. And when you kind of marry that together with the amount of business that's being done, with the amount of U.S.-trained Chinese nationals who go back, if anything, and I think Ambassador Locke mentioned it in Beijing in March, there's 150,000 Chinese students who study in the United States, only, I believe, 10,000 Americans who do. We must increase the knowledge by our American young population of China, because it is natural that they get to know each other, appreciate each other, and work constructively with each other.
And I must say, I have a 9-year-old daughter. A lot of her friends are Chinese, and she's learning Mandarin because she wants to know more about her friends and the culture. Anyways, our thanks to this fantastic panel. We're running out of time, and I know we have a special presentation. Come on, one more question. David, don't yell. One more
I have
question.
a question for Mr. Sack. I just read the newspaper yesterday. Two very big, largest telecom company named Huawei and Zhongxin. I'm not sure you know these two companies. And they have a problem doing business in United States. So what do you think if Chinese company come to the United States doing business and the government do not want them to do the business? So in this situation, what do you think?
Well, I think it's. I think it isn't one size fits all. I think one really has to look at each company itself. I think careful planning and understanding is important. I think to get the right kind of consultants involved who know the U.S. market, know what the areas of sensitivity are, understand how best to work it through. Much of this is a human dynamic issue. It's a political issue as well as a business issue. But I think it's important that there be open discussions and really very careful planning that takes place as one thinks about entering the market itself. Valuation is an issue, but beyond valuation, it's really a question of all the other dynamics that we've identified here on the panel. And so it really is part of that cooperation we talked about, working with experts who have worked on both sides of the Pacific and who are really able to help guide and help to bridge the cultural differences between the two.
Cooperation, understanding, education.
Certainly, we know that. I think this happens all the time. It just happened in the wrong time. The politician, both sides, China, United States, government change, so it's sensitized. But I think this is two ways. A good lesson for China to get more transparent.
Right.
We have learned. And also a good lesson to the United States. This is something will happen more and more in the future. You have to find a good way to deal with it, to get partner with China. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.